You don't belong here. Get out. The words cut like a blade, sharp and cold, echoing through the sterile white halls of the hospital. All eyes turned to the elderly black man standing near the receptionist's desk. He was dressed in a clean but slightly faded button-down shirt and neatly pressed slacks, respectable, yet modest. His hands gripped the handle of a leather bag that looked older than some of the nurses walking by. "Sir, I need you to leave the premises immediately," the police officer barked, stepping closer, his hand resting near his holster. "I'm here to visit a friend," the man replied, his voice calm but firm. He reached into his pocket to retrieve the visitor's pass he had signed for earlier that day, but the officer's hand shot forward, grabbing his arm. "Don't move," the officer snapped. "I said get out." The elderly man froze, his jaw tightening as the officer's grip dug into his skin. Patients and staff began to stare, some with pity, others with disgust. "This isn't a place for people like you," the officer hissed, yanking the man's arm harder. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but you're leaving. Now." The man's chest heaved, but he didn't resist. Instead, he tried to speak again, keeping his voice steady. "I have every right to be here. I'm not leaving until I see my friend." The officer shoved him back, making the older man stumble against the counter. "Don't argue with me," the officer yelled, his voice echoing down the hall. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you, leave, or I'll arrest you right here." The crowd gasped. Nurses whispered nervously. A security guard lingered near the entrance, uncertain whether to intervene. "Arrest me for what?" the man demanded, his voice rising. "For visiting a sick friend? For standing here quietly while you humiliate me in front of all these people?" The officer smirked. "For trespassing. And for resisting arrest if you keep talking." The man's breathing slowed, but his eyes locked onto the officer's, calm, steady, and piercing. "You don't know who I am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the crowd. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," the officer sneered. "You're nobody." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The older man stood tall, refusing to back down despite the humiliation burning in his chest. His shoulders squared, but the officer only pushed harder, shoving him toward the door. "Get out before I drag you out." The man stumbled again but caught himself. "Is this what you do?" he asked, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with controlled rage. "Throw out anyone who doesn't look the way you think they should? Harass people because you can?" "Enough," the officer barked, snapping the cuffs around the man's wrists. The metal bit into his skin, but he didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake," the man warned, his voice calm again, too calm. The officer laughed. "The only mistake here was letting you walk through that door in the first place." The crowd fell silent as the man was dragged toward the exit, his shoulders squared and his head held high. The murmurs grew louder, but no one stepped forward. No one said a word. As the officer shoved him outside and slammed the doors behind him, the older man stood there, staring at the glass. His reflection looked back, calm, steady, but wounded. And yet, there was something else in his eyes. Determination. Resolve. And something the officer had failed to notice, something that would change everything. Because what the officer didn't know, what no one in that hospital knew, was that this wasn't just any man. This man was a veteran. A decorated war hero. A survivor. And what happened next would leave everyone, especially the officer, absolutely stunned. How could a man who had faced death on the battlefield be treated like this in his own country? And what would he do to make sure no one ever underestimated him again? Stay with us until the end of this story to find out how this confrontation took a shocking turn, one that no one saw coming. Hello, and welcome to Plow of Twist. Before we dive into today's powerful story, we want to take a moment to say something important. This channel stands firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We believe in equality, respect, and the power of stories to inspire change. To every Black viewer watching this, your voice matters, your story matters, and you matter. Now, sit back and get ready for an emotional and thought-provoking journey. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here, and enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold glow across the hospital's waiting area. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long in the pot. Rows of stiff, plastic chairs lined the walls, most of them occupied by tired faces, families clutching bags, children fidgeting, and elderly couples sitting in silence. In one corner of the room, Samuel Reed adjusted his tie for the third time, trying to smooth the wrinkles in his shirt. He wasn't dressed to impress, but old habits from his military days never died. Presentation mattered. His dark brown skin had deep creases carved by time and experience, and the salt and pepper hair that framed his face only added to the weight he carried in his eyes. Samuel had spent the better part of the morning sitting in one of those uncomfortable chairs, occasionally glancing at the clock above the reception desk. His best friend, Henry, was in the ICU after a stroke. They had served together in Vietnam, shared foxholes, rations, and nightmares. Henry had been more than a friend, he was a brother. And now Samuel was here, hoping for a few minutes by his side. The hospital had been busy that day. Nurses shuffled between patients, and the occasional announcement echoed overhead, barely understandable. Samuel had been patient, polite, even, when the receptionist told him visiting hours hadn't started yet. He understood the rules. He always followed the rules. But as the hours dragged on and others were let through without issue, irritation began to simmer just beneath his calm exterior. He knew what it was. He'd seen the looks when he walked in, how the receptionist's smile faltered the moment their eyes met, how the security guard near the door suddenly stood up a little straighter. Samuel had felt it too many times before. It wasn't always blatant. Sometimes it came as lingering stares or polite but dismissive tones. Other times, like today, it was more obvious. The tension had started building the moment Officer Kyle Barker entered the waiting room. Kyle was young, probably mid-30s, with sharp features and a military-style buzz cut. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished to a shine. He walked like he owned every room he entered, chest out and chin high. The way his eyes scanned the crowd said more than words ever could. He wasn't here to protect. He was here to control. Samuel had noticed him right away, just like Kyle had noticed Samuel. It started with a glance, brief but pointed. Then came the pacing. Kyle's boots echoed against the tile floor as he circled the room like a hawk. Samuel ignored it at first. He'd dealt with men like Kyle before. But the second Kyle approached the receptionist's desk and started whispering, Samuel knew. He felt it coming before it even happened. Kyle's shadow fell over him as the officer stepped closer. "You've been sitting here a long time," Kyle said, his voice flat but edged with authority. Samuel looked up, meeting his eyes. "Waiting to visit a friend." "Who?" "Henry Carter. He's in the ICU." Kyle didn't bother checking the records. Instead, he crossed his arms. "You sure you're in the right place?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Pretty sure." Kyle smirked, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't a shelter. It's a hospital. People don't just hang around here." "I'm not hanging around," Samuel said evenly. "I'm visiting someone. I signed in at the desk. Don't get smart with me." Kyle leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "You've been sitting here all morning, and I don't like it. Makes people uncomfortable." Samuel's fingers clenched around the strap of his bag. "I didn't realize visiting a sick friend was a crime." Kyle's smile faded, replaced by something colder. "Stand up." Samuel didn't move. Excuse me. I said stand up, Kyle repeated, louder this time. Heads turned in their direction. Samuel rose slowly, towering just slightly over Kyle. I don't want trouble. You already found it, Kyle shot back, reaching for his cuffs. The room went silent as Samuel's arms were yanked behind his back, the cold metal snapping shut around his wrists. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Is this necessary? A nurse finally spoke up, her voice shaky. Stay out of it, Kyle barked. Samuel didn't resist, but his voice carried enough weight to make the nurse flinch. This isn't right. Kyle smirked. Welcome to reality. The sound of boots and shuffling echoed as Kyle marched him toward the exit. People avoided eye contact, pretending not to see what was happening. Samuel didn't shout or struggle. He didn't beg for someone to step in. Instead, he kept his head high, the hum of humiliation burning just beneath his skin. Outside, the heat hit hard, but Samuel barely felt it. Kyle shoved him against the wall, his eyes sharp and unyielding. You're lucky I'm not hauling you downtown, Kyle said. Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. You have no idea who I am. Kyle laughed. I don't need to know who you are. I already know what you are. Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the officer, his face unreadable. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't defeated. If anything, there was something unsettling in the way he looked at Kyle, like he already knew how this was going to end. Kyle didn't see it. Not yet. But he would. Because Samuel Reed wasn't just some old man sitting in a waiting room. He was a survivor, a man who had fought and bled for his country. And what Kyle had just done, this public humiliation, this abuse of power, wasn't going to be forgotten. Samuel wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And when the truth came out, when everyone saw him for who he really was, Kyle Barker's world was going to crumble. But how far would Samuel go to make sure justice was served? And how would Kyle react when the man he thought he'd broken turned out to be the one thing he never expected, a hero? Samuel Reed sat in the dim glow of his small, cluttered apartment, the hum of traffic outside barely breaking through the thick wall of silence surrounding him. The room was modest, faded curtains hung by the window, and a scuffed wooden table held the weight of time in every scratch and dent. A faded American flag folded into a tight triangle sat on the shelf above his bed, next to a worn leather-bound Bible that hadn't been opened in years. He ran his fingers over the cold metal dog tags in his palm, the letters etched into them almost worn smooth by decades of handling. The tags were more than identification, they were a lifeline, a reminder that he had endured. Samuel had carried those tags through heat, mud, and fire in Vietnam. He had buried friends wearing the same metal plates and had survived battles that still played in his dreams. And yet, after all that, after giving so much to the country he called home, he had been dragged out of a hospital like a criminal, humiliated in front of strangers. He closed his eyes, but the memory was sharp. The cold snap of the handcuffs. The sharp bite of Kyle Barker's words. The smirks. The stares. The silent judgment from people who didn't know him, didn't care to know him. The ringing of the phone startled him. It was sharp, cutting through the stillness. Samuel let it ring twice before picking it up. Samuel. Vanessa's voice came through, tight and trembling. It's Dad. He's awake, but you need to get here. Now. Her urgency hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood without another word, grabbing his coat as he stepped out the door and into the cool night air. The hospital loomed ahead as Samuel approached, its harsh fluorescent lights glowing against the night sky. The automatic doors slid open, and the sterile smell hit him immediately. The receptionist from earlier was still at the desk. She looked up and froze, recognition flashing in her eyes before she glanced nervously toward the elevator. Samuel knew why. Kyle Barker. And sure enough, the officer emerged from the elevator, his boots hitting the tile floor like gunshots. "You've got to be kidding me," Kyle said, stepping forward and planting himself firmly between Samuel and the hallway. Samuel squared his shoulders, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I'm here to see my friend." Kyle's smirk returned. "We've been over this already. You're not welcome here." Samuel took a deliberate step closer, his eyes locking onto Kyle's. "I'm not leaving this time." The air between them thickened, and for a moment, it seemed like Kyle might reach for his cuffs again. But before either man could speak, Vanessa's voice cut through the tension. "Officer Barker," she said sharply, appearing at the top of the stairs with a clipboard in hand. "He's with me." Kyle's head snapped up, and the smirk faded. Vanessa was more than just Henry's daughter, she was sharp, confident, and carried herself with authority. As a lawyer, she knew the rules better than anyone in that room, and the challenge in her eyes left Kyle no room to argue. Samuel didn't hesitate. He brushed past Kyle and followed Vanessa upstairs without another word. Henry looked older than Samuel remembered. His skin was pale, and the tubes running from his arm made him look fragile in a way that didn't sit right. But when Henry opened his eyes and saw Samuel, a tired smile stretched across his face. "Took you long enough," Henry rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel pulled up a chair and leaned forward. "You always were impatient." Henry chuckled softly before wincing in pain. The laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence. "Vanessa told me what happened downstairs," Henry finally said, his voice quieter this time. "It's nothing," Samuel replied, shaking his head. "The hell it is," Henry snapped, the fire in his voice making Samuel sit back. "You don't let people like him get away with that." Samuel looked down at his hands, the weight of Henry's words pressing on him. "And what do you suggest I do? Make a scene? Give him a reason to throw me in jail for real?" Henry's eyes hardened. "No. I'm saying you remind him who you are." Vanessa stepped forward, her voice softer than her father's. "I can file a formal complaint. I know people in the precinct. We can make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Samuel shook his head. "Not yet." "Not yet?" Vanessa repeated, her voice rising. "After what he did?" "Not yet," Samuel said again, his tone firm. "But soon." The elevator ride back down felt heavier than the one going up. Samuel's reflection in the metal doors looked older, tired but steady. When the doors slid open, Kyle was still there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Back so soon?" Kyle sneered. Samuel didn't hesitate. He stepped out slowly, his eyes locked on the officers. "You like this, don't you?" Kyle's smirk widened. "Like what?" "Pushing people around." Samuel's voice was low but sharp. Kyle straightened slightly, his confidence wavering for just a moment. "I do my job." Samuel stepped closer, his voice calm. "Funny. That's what they told me before they dropped us into the jungle. That we were just doing our jobs." Kyle's expression faltered, but Samuel didn't wait for a response. He walked past him, each step deliberate, leaving the officer frozen in place. At home, Samuel sat at the small wooden table, pulling out a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside, the metals glimmered faintly under the light, bronze stars, purple hearts. Proof of sacrifices made and battles survived. But metals didn't matter here. Samuel picked up the newspaper clipping buried beneath them, a feature from years ago that called him a hero. He stared at it, the words feeling hollow now. He wasn't done. Not yet. Kyle Barker had made a mistake. He had underestimated Samuel Reed. And when the truth came out, when Kyle saw who he had humiliated, everything would change. Justice wasn't just coming. It was already here. And Kyle Barker was about to face it in ways he could never have imagined. The hospital lobby was draped in artificial light, its sterile walls reflecting the faint hum of fluorescent fixtures overhead. Samuel Reed stood just beyond the automatic doors, his feet planted firmly on the polished tile floor, his eyes locked on the steel elevator doors ahead. His breath was steady, measured, but his chest felt tight, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. Every step that had led to this moment replayed in his mind, the humiliation, the handcuffs, the stairs. He felt the heat of it, the sting of indignation that had burned through him ever since Officer Kyle Barker had thrown him out like garbage. Samuel wasn't the type to hold grudges, but this wasn't about pride. It was about dignity. About standing up when others sat down. About making sure men like Kyle Barker knew they couldn't get away with stepping on people just because they thought no one would fight back. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open. Kyle stepped out, his boots clicking sharply against the tile floor as if the sound alone could announce his authority. He wasn't in uniform this time. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a fitted button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to show the veins in his forearms. But the badge clipped to his belt still caught the light. It was always there, like an anchor that let him throw his weight around. Kyle's eyes landed on Samuel immediately, and the smirk that stretched across his face was the same one that had burned into Samuel's memory the night he was dragged out of the hospital. It was the look of a man who thought he had already won. "What the hell are you doing here?" Kyle asked, his voice sharp and low, but loud enough to carry across the empty lobby. Samuel didn't flinch. He held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Kyle's smirk widened. "About what? You still crying about what happened? You want to whine to somebody? Go ahead. File your little complaint. Won't make a damn bit of difference." Samuel stepped forward, his voice low enough to draw Kyle's attention but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You don't even know who you're talking to, do you?" Kyle's jaw twitched. "I know exactly who you are. You're a guy who doesn't know when to quit." Samuel's hands flexed at his sides, but he didn't break eye contact. "You made a mistake, Officer Barker." Kyle's smile faded. "Don't threaten me." "That's not a threat," Samuel said, his eyes steady. "It's a fact." Kyle stepped closer, squaring his shoulders in an attempt to loom over Samuel, but the older man didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, before holding it out for Kyle to see. Kyle hesitated, his eyes flicking to the paper before snatching it from Samuel's hand. The smirk returned as he scanned the headline, but it faded almost instantly as he read the words. "Vietnam War Hero Honored for Bravery." The headline hung in the air like smoke. Kyle's eyes dropped to the grainy black and white photograph below it, a younger Samuel Reed in uniform, medals pinned across his chest, standing at attention with a look of determination that hadn't faded with age. Kyle's mouth opened, but no words came out. "That's me," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady but sharp enough to pierce through Kyle's silence. "That's who you dragged out of here in handcuffs. A man who bled for this country. A man who nearly died so you could stand here today wearing that badge." Kyle's grip on the paper tightened, but he didn't look up. Samuel stepped closer. "You looked at me and saw nothing. You saw what you wanted to see. And that's the problem, isn't it?" Kyle's jaw clenched, but his voice faltered when he spoke. "So what? You think that gives you a free pass?" Samuel didn't back down. "No. But it should have earned me your respect." Kyle's voice sharpened, the defensiveness creeping back in. "Respect? You want respect? Then follow orders next time." Samuel's eyes darkened. "Orders? Is that what you call it? Humiliating a man for no reason? Abusing your badge because you can? You were causing a scene," Kyle snapped. "I was standing up for myself," Samuel shot back. "You were trespassing." "I was visiting a friend." Kyle's voice rose. You don't get to play the victim here. Samuel stepped even closer, their faces inches apart. You're the only one playing games, Barker. Playing tough. Playing judge. But here's the thing, you're not fooling anyone. Not anymore. Kyle's eyes darted toward the receptionist's desk. The same nurse who had witnessed the earlier confrontation now stood frozen, her eyes darting between the two men. Other hospital staff lingered in the background, trying not to stare but unable to look away. Kyle's voice wavered. You can't prove anything. Samuel reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his phone. Can't I? He turned the screen toward Kyle. You think nobody saw? You think nobody recorded what happened? Kyle's face paled. I already sent it to Vanessa, Samuel continued, his voice calm but cutting. Her firm is very interested in what you did. But it's not just her. It's every single person who stood by and let it happen. It's everyone who thought they could look away and pretend it didn't matter. Kyle's shoulders stiffened, but his eyes flicked toward the exit like a man looking for a way out. You had a choice, Samuel said, his voice softer now but no less sharp. You could have stopped. You could have treated me like a man. But you didn't. And now you're going to answer for it. The nurse stepped closer. Is everything okay here? Kyle swallowed hard. It's fine, he muttered. We're done. Samuel shook his head. No. We're not. And in that moment, Kyle finally saw it, the unshakable resolve in Samuel's eyes. The strength of a man who had survived wars and battles far worse than this. Footsteps echoed behind them. Vanessa appeared, flanked by two men in suits. She handed Kyle a document, her voice steady. You've been served. Kyle's hands shook as he took the papers. Samuel leaned in one last time, lowering his voice. Next time, think twice before you judge a man by what you see on the surface. And with that, Samuel turned and walked away, leaving Kyle standing there, his world collapsing around him. Kyle Barker's hands trembled as he stared down at the papers in his grip. The words blurred for a moment, but the bold print at the top of the page cut through the haze. Internal investigation, official suspension notice. His heart pounded in his chest. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed harsher now, burning into his skin. He looked up and found Samuel Reed still standing there, calm and steady, his gaze fixed on him like a storm held just beneath the surface. Kyle swallowed hard. You don't get it, he said, his voice quieter now but still defensive. You're blowing this out of proportion. Samuel didn't blink. Am I? Kyle's voice cracked as he took a step closer, lowering his voice even though the weight of the room made it feel like every whisper echoed. I did my job. You didn't listen. You escalated things. Samuel stepped forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming. I escalated things. His voice didn't rise, but it carried so much weight that Kyle instinctively took a step back. You put your hands on me. You threw me out like garbage. You humiliated me in front of strangers, and for what? Because I sat quietly in a hospital waiting room? Kyle's eyes darted around the lobby. Nurses were still watching. The receptionist pretended to type, but her gaze kept flickering toward them. The tension was so thick it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. You don't understand, Kyle snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. You think this is about race? About power? It's not. It's about keeping order. About doing what needs to be done. Samuel's jaw tightened. Order. He stepped closer, and Kyle flinched. You call what you did order? You think the rules only apply when it's convenient for you? Kyle's eyes burned. I followed protocol. No, Samuel said sharply. You followed your bias. You saw a black man in a nice building, sitting quietly, and you decided that didn't look right. So you used your badge to justify what you already wanted to do. Kyle's breath hitched. Samuel cut him off. You know what I've seen. I've seen real chaos. I've seen men scream for their mothers while bullets tore through their bodies. I've seen soldiers, good soldiers, lay down their lives for strangers they didn't even know. I've seen what real courage looks like. And I've seen what cowardice looks like too. Kyle froze, his fists tightening at his sides. I'm not a coward. Samuel stepped so close that their faces were only inches apart. Then prove it. Kyle blinked. What? Prove it, Samuel repeated. Own what you did. Admit it. Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. His throat felt tight, his chest heavier with every second that passed. I didn't mean, Kyle stopped himself, the frustration in his voice boiling just under the surface. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Samuel didn't back away. But it did. Kyle looked down, his eyes darting back to the papers in his hands. You want me to admit that what? That I made a mistake? No, Samuel said, his voice softer but no less firm. I want you to admit that you let your prejudice guide you. That you let your fear, or your anger, or whatever the hell it was, turn you into someone you probably don't even recognize anymore. Kyle's chest rose and fell quickly. The words hit harder than he expected. You think you know me? Kyle snapped, but it didn't have the same bite as before. You think you know what it's like to do this job? To wake up every day knowing people hate you just because of the uniform you wear? Samuel's eyes didn't leave his. You think I don't know what it's like to be hated because of how I look? Kyle froze. Samuel leaned in closer. You've never had to prove you belong in your own country. You've never had to explain why you're somewhere. You've never had to wonder if the person sworn to protect you might be the one who hurts you. So no, Kyle. I don't know what it's like to wear that badge. But I know what it's like to be afraid of it. Kyle looked away, his jaw tightening, but he had no words to fire back. Samuel stepped back, letting the silence settle between them before he spoke again. I don't hate you, Kyle. But I hate what you stand for. And so should you. Kyle's shoulders dropped slightly, the fight draining from him as the words hung in the air. He wanted to argue. He wanted to push back. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Samuel turned and began walking toward the door, leaving Kyle standing there with his suspension papers still clutched in his hand. But before Samuel reached the exit, Kyle's voice broke the silence. Wait. Samuel stopped but didn't turn around. Kyle's voice cracked. I was wrong. Samuel turned slowly, his face calm but unreadable. What was that? Kyle's eyes dropped to the floor, shame burning in his chest. I said I was wrong. Samuel studied him for a long moment, letting the weight of the admission settle before he nodded. Now do something about it, Samuel said quietly. Kyle swallowed hard, nodding faintly as Samuel finally turned and walked out of the hospital. The air outside felt lighter, but Samuel's steps were slow. He knew this wasn't over. Kyle Barker still had a long road ahead of him, and Samuel wasn't sure if the man would take it. But tonight was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel Reed felt like the weight he'd been carrying for years had finally begun to lift. Kyle Barker stood alone in the empty hospital corridor, his back pressed against the cold wall as the papers trembled in his hands. The silence that surrounded him was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. His mind raced, replaying the confrontation with Samuel Reed over and over again. Each word hit harder now that he was standing there alone, stripped of the authority he had once carried like armor. The suspension notice felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. It wasn't just the investigation, it was what came with it. The whispers, the judgment, the eyes of his colleagues who would no longer look at him the same way. He thought about his father, a decorated police sergeant who had built his career on respect and discipline. What would he think if he saw Kyle now? Would he defend him, or be ashamed? Kyle pushed off the wall and started walking, his steps echoing against the polished tile. He wanted to leave, to escape the weight of the moment, but his feet felt heavier with every step. It wasn't until he reached the front doors that he realized he wasn't ready to walk out. Not yet. Instead, he turned and looked back at the elevator, the same elevator where Samuel Reed had stood tall, unshaken, and forced Kyle to face himself in a way he never had before. The memory hit hard. Samuel's words hadn't just called out Kyle's actions, they had exposed his fears. His insecurities. His guilt. Kyle's hand clenched around the papers, crumpling the edges. He thought about chasing after Samuel, about saying something, anything, to fix it. But what could he say? Sorry. That word felt too small, too shallow to carry the weight of what had happened. Upstairs, Samuel sat quietly in Henry's hospital room, the faint beeping of the monitors filling the silence. Henry was asleep now, his breathing steady but weak. Samuel watched his old friend, his mind still lingering on what had happened downstairs. He had done what needed to be done, he had stood his ground and demanded respect. But the weight in his chest hadn't lifted the way he thought it would. Instead, it felt heavier. The confrontation with Kyle had opened wounds Samuel thought had healed long ago, wounds he had buried under medals and certificates and carefully chosen words. Henry stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You're still here?" Samuel smiled faintly. "I'm not going anywhere." Henry's voice was soft, but his eyes were sharp. "You did it, didn't you?" Samuel nodded. "It's not over yet." Henry studied him for a long moment before speaking. "And what happens if it never is?" Samuel's smile faded. He knew what Henry meant. No matter what happened to Kyle Barker, no matter what the investigation uncovered or how the case ended, there would always be another Kyle. Another face. Another moment where Samuel would have to stand up and fight for what should have been his all along. Henry reached for Samuel's hand, his grip weaker than it used to be but still firm. "Don't let this eat you up," he said. "Don't let him win by carrying this around." Samuel squeezed his friend's hand and leaned back in the chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He didn't want to carry this anger. But letting it go felt impossible. Downstairs, Kyle was still pacing the lobby, his thoughts a mess of guilt, frustration, and shame. He pulled out his phone, staring at the screen like it might give him answers. Instead, he saw a flood of notifications, messages, emails, and missed calls. News of his suspension had already started to spread. He opened one of the messages, his stomach tightening as he read the words, "You're exactly what's wrong with this country." Kyle swallowed hard and scrolled to the next message. "You deserve everything that's coming to you." Message after message poured in, each one heavier than the last. For the first time, Kyle felt what it was like to be on the other side of judgment, to have strangers define him by a single moment, a single action. It was suffocating. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the door again. This time, he walked through it. The night air hit him hard, cold and sharp against his skin. He looked up at the dark sky, exhaling slowly as he tried to clear his thoughts. But no matter how much he tried, Samuel's words echoed in his head. "You let your fear guide you." Kyle didn't want to admit it, but it was true. He had been afraid, not of Samuel, but of what he represented. Kyle had spent his whole life believing he was one of the good guys, that his badge made him better than the men he arrested. But Samuel had stripped that away, leaving him exposed to a truth he wasn't ready to face. For the first time, Kyle saw himself clearly. And he didn't like what he saw. Samuel left the hospital an hour later, his steps slow but steady as he made his way to the parking lot. He didn't notice Kyle sitting on a bench near the entrance until their eyes met. Kyle stood quickly, his hands shoved in his pockets. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Samuel stopped, his expression unreadable. Kyle cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "I read the article," he said. "About you." Samuel didn't respond. Kyle shifted on his feet. "You saved lives. You," he stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "You didn't deserve what I did to you." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stayed silent. Kyle swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "But I needed you to know that I regret it." The words hung in the air, raw and uncertain. Samuel studied him, his eyes searching for something, truth, maybe, or weakness. Finally, he nodded once. "Good," he said. "Now do something about it." Kyle's eyes widened, but before he could respond, Samuel turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with the weight of his own reflection. Kyle sat back down, his head in his hands. The road ahead felt impossible, but for the first time, he was starting to see it clearly. And Samuel? He walked into the night without looking back, knowing that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every man who had ever been judged, dismissed, or silenced. And for them, he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Kyle Barker sat in his car with the engine off, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The hospital lights reflected faintly on the windshield, but he didn't see them. His mind was still trapped in the confrontation with Samuel Reed, the words, the look in his eyes, the weight of the truth Kyle hadn't wanted to face. He let out a sharp breath, leaning back in his seat. His badge rested on the passenger seat beside him, almost mocking him. For years, that badge had been his shield. It was the thing that separated him from the chaos he was sworn to control. But tonight, it felt heavier than ever, like a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying until it had been ripped away. Kyle's phone buzzed again, vibrating against the leather console. He didn't need to check it to know what it was. More messages. More reminders of the fallout. He had already seen enough to know that his name was spreading fast, on social media, on news sites, even in group chats with other officers. He picked up the phone reluctantly and opened one of the messages. "I thought you were better than this." His jaw clenched. The next message hit even harder. "You're exactly why people don't trust the police." Kyle dropped the phone back on the seat, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, he felt small, like a rookie again, fresh out of the academy, trying to prove himself to men who had already written him off. Except this time, it wasn't just his colleagues he had to prove himself to. It was everyone. And worst of all, it was himself. He thought about Samuel, about the way the older man had stood his ground without flinching. Kyle had spent years convincing himself that strength came from control, from making people obey. But Samuel had shown him something else, something harder to define. Strength that didn't need badges or weapons. Strength that came from surviving, from standing tall even after the world had tried to knock you down. The thought made Kyle sick to his stomach. He ran a hand through his hair and grabbed the phone again. His thumb hovered over Samuel's name in his recent calls. He had gotten the number earlier from Vanessa, though she hadn't handed it over without hesitation. Kyle didn't blame her. Finally, he hit the call button. The phone rang twice before Samuel answered, his voice low but steady. "Reed." Kyle swallowed. "It's Kyle." There was a long pause. "What do you want?" Kyle squeezed the steering wheel again. "I need to talk to you." "I said what I needed to say," Samuel replied. "I know," Kyle said quickly. "But I didn't." Another pause. Longer this time. Samuel finally spoke. "Where are you?" "Outside the hospital." "Stay there." The line went dead. Kyle exhaled slowly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the car. He didn't know what he expected from this conversation, but he knew he couldn't leave without having it. 15 minutes later, Samuel appeared, walking toward the car with the same steady presence that had rattled Kyle earlier. He stopped just outside the driver's side door, waiting. Kyle rolled down the window. "You're still here," Samuel said, his tone unreadable. Kyle nodded. "I didn't know where else to go." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And you thought coming to me would fix that?" Kyle looked away. "I don't know what I thought." Samuel stood there silently, letting the weight of the moment linger. "I screwed up," Kyle finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I know that." Samuel didn't respond, so Kyle kept going. I didn't see it at first. What I did. I thought I was just doing my job, but the more I think about it, the more I see how wrong it was." Samuel crossed his arms but didn't speak. Kyle's voice cracked. "I let my fear get the better of me. I saw you sitting there, and he paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't see you. I saw what I was taught to see. A threat. And I was wrong." Samuel's eyes softened, but only slightly. "You think saying that changes anything?" "No," Kyle admitted. "I don't. But I need to say it anyway." Samuel leaned closer to the window. "Why?" Kyle's throat tightened. "Because I don't want to be that man anymore." For the first time, Samuel's expression shifted, just a flicker of something softer beneath the surface. He studied Kyle carefully before stepping back. "Get out of the car," Samuel said. Kyle hesitated. "What?" "Get out." Kyle opened the door slowly and stepped out, facing Samuel directly. "You want to change?" Samuel asked. Kyle nodded. "Yeah." Samuel's eyes locked onto his. "Then prove it." "How?" Kyle's voice cracked. Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, making Kyle feel the weight of his words before speaking again. "You start by owning what you did, not just to me, but to yourself. You carry it. You learn from it. And you don't let it go." Kyle swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "And then," Samuel continued, "you make it right, not with me, but with every person you've ever treated like they were less than you. Because there's more than just me, Kyle. A lot more." Kyle's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I can't fix it?" Samuel stepped closer. "Then you live with it. And you let it remind you who you don't want to be." Kyle's eyes burned, but he blinked quickly, forcing himself to hold it together. Samuel studied him for another moment before nodding. "Go home, Kyle." Kyle opened his mouth to protest, but Samuel cut him off. "Go home," Samuel repeated. "And think long and hard about who you are and who you want to be." Kyle took a shaky breath and nodded. "Okay." Samuel turned and started walking away, his shoulders still squared and steady. But this time, Kyle didn't feel anger or resentment. He felt gratitude. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt hope. Kyle Barker sat at his kitchen table, the dim glow of the single overhead light casting shadows on the cracked tile floor. The suspension notice lay open in front of him, the words blurring as he stared at them. The house was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator, but Kyle's thoughts were deafening. He'd spent the last hour replaying Samuel Reed's words in his head, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You make it right." But how? Kyle rubbed his hands over his face, the rough stubble scratching against his palms. He hadn't slept in 2 days, not since the confrontation at the hospital. His phone sat face down on the table, vibrating occasionally with new messages, most of them angry, some from people he barely knew, and others from former friends who had suddenly gone silent. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. He reached for his phone, hesitating before unlocking it. He scrolled through the missed calls and stopped when he saw one from his father. Kyle let out a slow breath and pressed the call button. "Son," his father's voice came through almost immediately, steady but strained. "Been waiting for you to call." Kyle swallowed hard. "Yeah." His father didn't speak right away, and Kyle hated the silence that followed. He'd grown up chasing his father's approval, spending his childhood watching the older man put on his uniform with pride and coming home with stories about protecting the neighborhood. "You're in trouble," his father finally said. Kyle closed his eyes. "I know." His father's voice sharpened. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you have any idea what this looks like? Do you have any idea what it's doing to this family?" Kyle flinched. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "But it did, Kyle. It did." His father's voice rose, and Kyle could almost see him pacing in the living room, his face red with anger. "You think I worked my whole career for this? For my son to throw it all away in one night?" Kyle gritted his teeth. "I didn't throw anything away." His father scoffed. "Didn't you? Tell me something, did you even think before you put your hands on that man? Did you even stop to ask yourself if you were doing the right thing?" Kyle's throat tightened. "I thought I was." "Well, you weren't." His father's voice echoed through the phone, but then it softened, like the anger had drained out of him. "You weren't, Kyle. And now you're paying for it." Kyle's voice dropped. "I know." There was another pause, longer this time. "What are you going to do?" his father finally asked. Kyle stared down at the table, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." His father sighed. "Then figure it out. Because no one's coming to save you from this." The line went dead, and Kyle set the phone down, his hands trembling. He sat there for a long time, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. Meanwhile, Samuel Reed stood in front of his bathroom mirror, the harsh light reflecting every wrinkle and scar carved into his skin. He adjusted his collar, smoothing out the creases in his shirt. His hands were steady, but his eyes carried the weight of everything that had happened. He'd spent years trying to leave the war behind him, burying it under routines and quiet mornings. But no matter how far he tried to run, it always found him, whether it was in the nightmares that woke him up sweating or the battles he still had to fight in his own neighborhood. Samuel leaned forward, staring at his reflection. He didn't regret what he had done at the hospital. He didn't regret confronting Kyle or forcing him to face the truth. But the weight of it lingered. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. He opened it to find Vanessa standing there, her arms crossed, her face tight. "You okay?" she asked. Samuel stepped aside to let her in. "I'm fine." Vanessa shook her head as she dropped her bag onto the couch. "You don't look fine." Samuel sat down, his eyes following her as she paced. "What's wrong?" Vanessa turned to him, her voice sharp. "What's wrong? What's wrong is that Kyle Barker still hasn't been arrested. What's wrong is that people are already trying to sweep this under the rug like it didn't happen." Samuel leaned back in his chair. "You think I don't know that? Then why are you so calm?" "Because getting angry won't fix it." Vanessa's eyes softened slightly, but the fire in her voice didn't fade. "You can't just let this go, Samuel. People are watching. They're counting on you to see this through." Samuel looked away, his voice quieter now. "I know." Vanessa sat down across from him, her voice softer. "Then what are you waiting for?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He thought about Henry, about the look in his friend's eyes when he told him not to let this eat him alive. He thought about Kyle, the fear and regret in his voice when he'd finally admitted he was wrong. "I'm not waiting," Samuel finally said. "But this isn't about revenge, Vanessa. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." Vanessa nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "So what do we do?" Samuel looked her in the eye. "We keep fighting." Across town, Kyle sat in his living room, the suspension notice still on the table. He stared at it, his chest heavy with shame. The words Samuel had spoken earlier echoed in his head. Then prove it. Kyle didn't know if he could, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Chief Harris," a voice answered. Kyle took a breath. "I need to talk to you." The chief's voice sharpened. "You've got 5 minutes." Kyle swallowed hard. "I need to make this right." The chief didn't respond immediately, but Kyle could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "You sure about that?" the chief finally asked. Kyle's voice didn't waver this time. "Yeah. I'm sure." And with those words, the path ahead of him, uncertain, messy, and full of consequences, began to take shape. The courtroom was silent. Rows of spectators filled the benches, their eyes locked on the man seated at the defendant's table, Kyle Barker. He sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together on the table. His uniform was gone, replaced by a dark suit that didn't fit quite right, and his badge, once a symbol of authority, was nowhere in sight. Across the room, Samuel Reed sat calmly, his back straight, his eyes fixed forward. The lines on his face seemed deeper under the fluorescent lights, but his presence was unshaken. Vanessa sat beside him, a folder of documents in front of her, but her focus never wavered from Kyle. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Barker, do you have any final statements before I give my ruling?" Kyle stood slowly, his palms damp as he rested them on the table. He turned, scanning the room before his eyes finally landed on Samuel. He hesitated, his voice faltering as he began. "I can't undo what I did," Kyle said, his voice quieter than anyone expected. "And I'm not standing here to make excuses for it. I know what I did was wrong. I know I let fear and anger control me instead of reason. And I know that a man like Mr. Reed, someone who gave everything for this country, deserved better from me." Kyle looked down for a moment before meeting Samuel's eyes again. "I lost my job. My reputation. My friends. But none of that compares to what I took from him, his dignity. And I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life." The courtroom remained silent. Even the judge seemed to hesitate before speaking. "Mr. Barker," the judge said, "your actions were an abuse of power and a violation of public trust. However, given your acknowledgement of guilt and your cooperation with this investigation, the court is prepared to issue its ruling." Kyle braced himself as the judge continued. "You are sentenced to 200 hours of community service and required to complete a racial bias education program. Additionally, you will no longer be eligible to serve in law enforcement in this jurisdiction." Kyle exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the ruling settled on him. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply nodded and sat down. As the gavel fell, Samuel stood. He didn't smile or celebrate. Instead, he walked calmly toward the exit, his step steady. Vanessa followed closely behind, but before they reached the door, Kyle's voice stopped them. "Mr. Reed." Samuel turned, meeting Kyle's gaze. "Thank you," Kyle said, his voice raw. "For giving me a chance to face this instead of running from it." Samuel nodded. "Make it count." Kyle's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he sat back down, his head hanging low. Outside the courthouse, Samuel paused on the steps, looking up at the sky as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. Vanessa touched his arm gently. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." Vanessa smiled softly. "You did it, Samuel." Samuel looked out at the people gathered outside, the reporters, the protesters, the supporters. He took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. "No," he said. "We did." In the weeks that followed, Kyle began his community service at a local shelter, where he worked under the supervision of none other than Samuel Reed. It was awkward at first, uncomfortable in ways that neither man could fully articulate. But as the days passed, conversations began to replace silence. Kyle asked questions. Samuel gave answers. And somewhere in between painting walls and organizing donations, Kyle started to listen. Really listen. By the time his service ended, Kyle had learned more about himself than he ever thought possible. He didn't fix everything, but he started. And sometimes, that was enough. For Samuel, the victory wasn't just in Kyle's punishment, it was in the conversations that followed. People started talking, sharing their own experiences, and pushing for change. Samuel found himself at the center of something bigger than he had expected, and for the first time in years, he felt like his voice truly mattered. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And it was about proving that even the most broken systems could be challenged. And Henry? He made it out of the hospital and back home, where he continued to push Samuel to keep fighting, for himself and for others. As Samuel sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of orange and purple, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Now, to all of you listening to this story, let me ask you this: how often do we judge someone before we know their story? How often do we let assumptions guide us instead of empathy? Samuel Reed's story reminds us that strength doesn't always come from fighting battles, it comes from standing tall when the world tries to knock you down. It comes from demanding respect, not just for yourself but for others who can't fight back. And Kyle Barker? He reminds us that redemption isn't about erasing mistakes, it's about owning them and doing the hard work to make things right. So here's the question for you: what would you have done in Samuel's shoes? And more importantly, what will you do the next time you see injustice? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what this story made you feel and what it made you think about. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to Tales of Twist, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful story. Thanks for listening, and remember, every twist in life has the power to change us if we're willing to face it.